Dear audience, please enjoy the author of Pirates in Navy, Tendayi Viki.
Hey everyone.
Hi Tendayi.
How are you?
Good, take it away.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do now is going to just share my flight deck to make sure that people can see what I'm talking about, and then we can just take it from there. So let me put this up here. Great, I can see that. Thank you for having me. Always an honor to sort of speak at these events. Really always enjoy speaking at these events. And I really want to sort of, the topic I'm talking about today is something that is kind of very, very, very close to my heart, being that, I work in an organization that's really focused on making sure that people create sustainably profitable business models. And so some of the conversations that I have with people that are working in social enterprises or working in organizations that are focused on financial inclusion or other types of inclusion is to really think about how we can make our sustainability projects sustainable, right? How do we make the stuff that we're working on sustainable by making sure that it's got really great business models that support the wonderful missions that we're actually working on. And so I'd like to start by just sort of giving you an example of like Microplace, which was a capital raising organization sort of for microfinance. It was similar to Kiva, and it was founded in 2006. And then it was acquired by eBay in the same year. That's how much excitement it was generating. And eBay later moved it to PayPal. But what's interesting about this, right, is even though the mission was very good and they were really offering really great microloans to people that really needed these on the bottom of the pyramid, in January 2014, it was announced that Microplace would actually stop or cease offering in investments, right? PayPal had actually decided to shut them down because, as an organization, they could not reach sufficient revenues to make it really interesting for the organization or for the business itself to be sustainably scalable. And so while they had the social inclusion or the social impact part down, the reason why they became unsuccessful was just because they didn't have the business part sort of sorted. And so that's really what I want to talk about today, which is how can we make sustainability more sustainable? And so when I was preparing for this talk, I kind of read a lot of reports on why social enterprises fail or why organizations that focus on social inclusion or impact fail. I read reports from the World Economic Forum, The Guardian, Failure Institute, and various others. And they listed several reasons for this, right? Teams, context, funding, et cetera, et cetera. But when you boil it down to like the absolute finding, the thing that they found was that these projects fail because the founders and the companies are broke and idealistic. And so these two things, which is they're very, very idealistic, but they're not sustainable because they're broke, are really the reasons why these organizations fail. Which led me to think that actually, when you really think about this, you can really organize it along two dimensions, right? Because Jeanette Bompas, who was the chief communications officer at Microplace, likes to say that if you're going to sell eco soap, that soap better clean stuff better than regular soap, right? It needs to be a better value proposition. The value proposition can't be just that it's eco soap. Because if your eco soap does a terrible job cleaning, then you cannot expect to be a successful social entrepreneur. And so it's not just that the missions that we're focused on are good. For that goodness to be sustainable, we also need to think about how we make it sort of viable and we create value propositions that actually resonate with customers and we create business models around that actually works. And so I actually think that there's two dimensions that you have to sort of think about if you're going to work in sort of building great social inclusion businesses. One is the social inclusion piece, the social impact of the social mission that you have. But then the other one is the enterprise piece, which is you really need to be focused on making sure you're creating an enterprise that actually delivers value in a way that's sustainable and also that you can actually scale. And when you think about this, right, this actually leads to four different types of social innovators or four different types of innovators, if you want to call it that. The worst kind of innovator, the one that you don't want to be, is the depressed villain, the one who has a failing enterprise that has low social value. So you don't definitely want to be a depressed villain. Not only are you doing stuff that's of low social value, but you're not even very good at that. And so that's like the worst kind of sort of innovator you might want to be. But the other one that's interesting that you also don't want to be is the super charlatan, which is you have a really successful enterprise, but it's got very, very low social value, right? We also don't want to do that in this space. Now, what we do have a lot of the times when we think about our social inclusion enterprises is what I like to call the starving artist, the broken idealistic, right? The people who have a really high social value, really high levels of social inclusion, but they have a failing enterprise, right? And also, so these three things are things you don't really want to be. What you really want to be is a great social innovator, right? Somebody that creates a really successful enterprise that's got really high social value. And so when you dive deeper and start thinking about this sort of social innovator, you really start to reach the conclusion that a great social innovator creates a really great stakeholder value for the stakeholders that they're working with, plus they combine that with a really great business model or sustainably profitable business model that can actually fund the work that they're trying to actually do. And so let's like dive deeper a little bit, right, and think about, okay, if you're going to be a social innovator, what do we mean when we say stakeholder value? Because a lot of the times when people are thinking about, social inclusion, they're really thinking about just the beneficiary. So even when you look at this website, there's a picture of the beneficiary there with a microfinance investment. You can help and strengthen families all over the world. And I think that's a really wonderful mission to actually do that. But when you're thinking about these sorts of business models, there's also another sort of stakeholder that is really important, which are the individual investors who are making these microloans, right? And so just because our mission is good does not mean that we're going to be viewed as a great value proposition for the investor. There's sometimes a mismatch there. We're only going to be perceived as good to the individual investor when we actually have a fit between what we're offering and what the investor perceives as valuable. Now, in this case, I'm saying investor because I'm talking about microfinance, but it could be any other stakeholder, right? You need this sort of problem solution fit. You need to make sure that the offering that you're creating and the value that you're creating is kind of connected to what your stakeholders perceive as value. And your stakeholders are not just the beneficiary. If you want to make something sustainable, you have to think beyond the beneficiary and start thinking about how you can deliver value in other ways as well. And so Kiva did this really well, right? So, back again to Jenna Bumpus, who was the chief communications officer at Microplace. And she knows that Kiva was kind of similar to Microplace in a lot of ways. It was their main competitor. And so they did the same thing that Microplace did, right? They kind of invested, they kind of got individual investors to sort of fund these microloans, people who were looking for an ability to make these, to make small payments. They're not very wealthy people. They just want to make like small loans here and there so that they can help people out, right? And they were, both companies had kind of a similar business model. They were both working through microfinance institutions, right? Local, who were then handing out these loans to local people. But the difference is that Kiva got a lot of traction because what it did was it created a connection between the investors and the recipients, right? They made it look as if you were investing directly in a specific person. And so one of the gains that people want to feel is they want to feel connected with the people that they're helping. And so, Kiva made it look as if you were investing directly in a specific person. So they would say, like, invest $10 in Tendayi, who's a micro entrepreneur working in Bangladesh. And look, here's a picture of Tendayi, and here's a note from Tendayi, right? And so they made people feel connected. And so this actually sort of helped them create more traction. Whereas, Microplace was like, invest in this microfinance institution, and then this microfinance institution is then going to invest in people. And so that distance made it really hard for them to create traction and connection with individual investors. And so, you need to sort of be able to create this great value proposition that resonates with all stakeholders so that you can build sustainability. And so that really matters when we then start thinking again deeply to say, okay, sometimes you can actually create great stakeholder value, but still fail to become sustainable. And how does that actually happen? Well, it happens because sometimes you're not really thinking about the business model that surrounds the value that you're thinking about creating. And so, sure, I mean, you can say you want to give one laptop to every child around the world, which is a really great mission. But then in business model terms, how is this even sustainable and scalable? And so what this means is that, like, when we're working on our social enterprises, we really need to be thinking about how we're going to create value, deliver value, and get value back into our organizations. Right? We've got all this. We've got a very positive value proposition here that we're trying to offer to our beneficiaries there. But then the question is, how do we get that value to them? What channels are we going to use? What kind of relationships are the right ones to sort of build, right? And then, in the backstage, you can be thinking again about, like, how do you actually create this value? Like, what do you need to build in terms of infrastructure to create this value in a sustainable way? But even more importantly, and this is something that we often neglect when we're working on our inclusion enterprises, is how do you get value back? Like, how do you actually get value back from the work that you're doing that is greater than the costs that you're paying to create the value? If you can solve this formula here, this profit formula, you then can say you've built a sustainably profitable enterprise. And once you've built a sustainably profitable enterprise, now you've made your mission sustainable, because now you've got enough funding. The project is self-funding, the business is self-funding, in order to carry on doing what it's actually doing. And so what we don't want is the dreamy, idealistic founder who neglects everything else that allows them to become successful. And a really great example of an organization that's got a really fantastic business model is Living Goods, right? It was founded in 2007 by Chuck Slaughter, and their goal is to sort of build sustainable community health systems at scale. And what they do is they focus on a short list of diseases like malaria and diarrhea, and they sell goods to people at the bottom of the pyramid, such as water filters or fortified foods or bed nets. And what's interesting about them is that they've got a really great mission, really great products, and they've even done research, with various academics that shows that the work that they're doing really has impact on the people that they're serving. But what makes their impact more sustainable is the business model that they've built around, right? So they focus on people in developing countries or people at the bottom of the pyramid. But what they've built is this sort of direct selling, sort of franchise business model where they kind of work with these women who are like sort of independent, self-employed, kind of like Avon agents, right? They're kind of like they kind of use this sort of Avon agent model, and so the relationships with their customers are actually personal, and the channels they use are these independent agents, right? Which are like women who receive a lot of training. They get like below market inventory loan and like a business in a bag, which includes like these branded uniforms, signs, basic, health and business tools, including smartphones. And then like they support these agents through like, networks of like branches and warehouses. And then the agents themselves are the ones that serve the clients via door-to-door visits, right? And sort of these home-based stores. And so you can see how this works because, this is kind of scalable because each agent can then serve over 700 people. And so this is a really great business model that they have here. And then because it's sustainably profitable, not only is it having an impact on the recipients who are the beneficiaries, but it's also having an impact on even the agents, and also then the business is able to be self-funding. And so when we're thinking about our enterprises, we shouldn't just think about the mission. We should really think about how we go from idea, or idealistic is maybe what I should have said, how we go from our ideals to a sustainable business. Now we know that when you're working on innovation, or when you're working on social innovation, the road is a little bit bumpy, right? It's kind of squiggly up and down. At the beginning you don't really know what you're doing, and things are going a little bit crazy and wobbly, and then you kind of get to the point where you figure it out, and then you have a sustainable business. But the thing that matters for all of us to really, really think about is at the core of the whole conversation is the sustainable business. Or if you want to call it that, we'll call it a sustainable mission, right? This ability to sustain the mission, right? We want to have a sustainable mission. And that's at the core of everything. We don't want to just be going because we have a positive mission and think we're going to succeed just because we have a positive mission. And so the question is, how do we actually do that? How do we systematically move from our ideals to a sustainable business? What kind of questions should we be solving for as social innovators? And that lies at the heart of whether we're going to be successful or not. And to illustrate those questions, I'm going to use this example of Aravind Eye Hospital, which is a hospital chain in India. It was funded by a doctor who's popularly known as Dr. V, which is the same thing I'm known, by the way, Dr. Tendayi V, but I'm not him. And it was founded in 1976. And it has grown into this network of sort of eye hospitals that have had a major impact on eradicating, cataract-related blindness in India. And they've performed over 4 million surgeries since being founded. And their model is really what people applaud, right? It's become a subject of numerous case studies across the world. And it's really adopted to the context. Because one of the things you see, like when you meet social entrepreneurs, especially like fintech inclusion entrepreneurs, they're kind of like, oh, bleary-eyed, yeah, we're going to transform this context. And they're trying to create products for contexts they've never lived in, trying to create products and services for places they've never been to. And they just think that because everything is online, things are just going to work out. So you really need to make sure that the business models that you're creating are actually adapted to the context. So you have to go to the context and actually really see. And so when you think about that then, right, and you're trying to be successful as a social innovator, what are the 4 key questions that you need to be able to answer? Well, the first key question that you need to be able to answer is the feasibility question, which is, can this be done at all? Like, what do we actually need to put in place? Not just in terms of technology or product, but what do we need to put in place as an organization in terms of the key activities that we do, the key resources that we need in order to be able to deliver the value proposition to our stakeholders? Like, we need to actually solve for that. And then finally, we also need to solve for desirability, which is, even if it can be done, should it be done? Like, who are the stakeholders? Often the problems that we're solving are very, very clear, and in terms of who has the pain and who has the need from a beneficiary perspective. But we also need to make sure that what we're creating is desirable for other stakeholders that will make up our whole business model work. And so not only should we have desirability for our beneficiaries, but we should also have desirability for everybody else in that support system around channels and creating relationships with those stakeholders. And then finally, another question, which sometimes sounds like an insult if you're thinking about a social enterprise, but you really need to be thinking about whether this can be done profitably, right? This is a really important question. And then the question that most people tend to neglect is the adaptability question, which is, even if we could do this and it should be done and it can be done profitably, is it adaptable to the context in which we're about to place it in, right? I mean, you can give laptops to children, but then what if they're in a classroom with no Wi-Fi or electricity? Like, what value is that? So we really need to be thinking about the context in which we're going in and really trying to make our business models more adaptable for that context. And so this is a really interesting business model that, the Aravind Hospital people focused on. And you can see in the image here that, rather than having the patients go to the doctors, they created an operating model where it's just the doctors that go to the patients. So you can see the patients kind of laying here in this really nice system where they can work on multiple patients at the same time. And then they created a system where doctors rotate between the free wards where they're helping the needy and the paid wards where people are actually paying for the same surgery. And they concentrate on efficiency and hygiene. So and they kind of were able to actually eliminate the differences between the surgeries that are done for paid patients versus non-paid patients. And that's what made their business model sustainable. So the paid patients kind of fund the surgeries that are happening for the non-paying patients, right? And then the system is really well managed. They kind of lowered infection rates. It was a really, really great system with a business model that was sustainable from a profitability perspective and also sustainable in terms of being adaptive to its context. And so I think you can see the message that I'm landing, right? As I kind of wrap up my talk here real quick, which is, which one of these are you going to be, right? Are you going to be a social innovator, right, and become really successful at building enterprises that are really high in social value, but also are successful in terms of business model? Or are you going to be, the shrinking super charlatan, depressed villain, or starving artist, right? And we really don't want to be in the starving artist zone. We want to migrate our idea towards being really great social innovators. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. The book is Pirates in the Navy. It's now available on Amazon. And I'm going to open up the session now to questions.
Thomas here.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Thomas.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So and that might be a little bit off topic, but I'll ask it anyway because there was a couple of guys just grabbing me and asking that question. So
right.
If we look at the landscape right now, the financial services landscape, and especially if we look at the incumbent players, whether that is pandemic or other things that actually has that implication, I don't know. But you see a lot of innovation unit internally being shut down. Some of the innovation people are being let go, or at least are struggling, right? So because the big financial institutions are becoming increasingly more inward focused. Yeah. And innovation are being put out in the business instead of being a unit in their own. So some of the questions I just got here was, what do you actually do? How come it's the same thing that happens every time crisis is knocking? Then the first thing that gets cut or shut down is HR, marketing, and innovation.
Well, I actually think that, and nobody ever gets rid of the chief finance officer, right, during a crisis. So one of the problems I think we have as innovators inside large organizations is we lack legitimacy. Like we're not seen as people that create value. And so a lot of innovators, by the time the crisis arrived, over the good years, they're not being recognized as something that has actually created something valuable for the organization or something to actually keep. We're not viewed as partners to help the organization navigate the crisis. And so sometimes when we have these conversations, when you're telling stories, you need the protagonist and the enemy. And often the enemy is often cast as the large organization that's closing everything down. But sometimes when you really stop and think about it, sometimes innovators themselves shoot themselves in the foot. So rather than do something that is valuable for the companies that they're working on, it's the same conversation we're having now about social impact and sustainable business model, right? Rather than do things that create value, we're all engaged in innovation theater. We're having hackathons, accelerators, speed dating, whatever it is, failure conferences, right? And the organization is funding this, but they're not seeing any returns from this. And so when it comes time to make decisions during a crisis, all they do is they just look at, okay, how much are we paying for these guys? Oh, $5 million a year. Okay, and how much revenue are they generating in new things? None. Okay, we'll close them. And then everybody's like, oh, these MBAs, they don't know anything about innovation, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think it's now time for innovators to really show how much value they create. And then when you actually say, listen, we generated over $100 million for this company every year, but they still shut us down, then okay, let's have a conversation about why that's happening. But for the time being, I think innovators are a little bit like whining people without really having created any value to begin with.
All right. So would you say, maybe just to build on that, because I'm thinking if you're a social innovator inside a large organization that is now struggling for several reasons, that's just difficult. Then you have a really hard time. Any good advices?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right there. So that was a situation that Microplace was in, right? Because Microplace started off as a startup, and then they got acquired by eBay and PayPal. Now, in that context, you have to make it interesting for them, right? And so, again, it's still the same thing. Like if you're a social enterprise, unless you are like under the non-profit aspect of the business, where the business is just like doing this stuff and they're giving it away free and they're using that as part of their social mission and they can put that in their end of year results, then okay, that's fine. But if you've placed yourself under, we not only going to have social impact, but we're also going to generate growth and revenue for the organization, now you're under pressure to do both things, and both things are equally important. And to the extent that you fail to actually generate the enterprise part, if the enterprise part of your mission is not successful, then of course the company can then decide to sort of close you down, because now you're just a cost center, right? And they can't even like claim you back as like tax credits because you're not being classified under like a non-profit donation, right?
All right, thanks, Tendayi. So, and excuse me for going a little bit rogue here because we completely didn't arrange for this. So I'm just going to ask you, because as you know, I'm a huge fan of you and your books. So what's going to be the next book? What will be the next book you're writing? What will it be about?
Yeah, so I'm working on like 2 projects right now. I'm always working on 2 books. I think it's a mental illness of some kind. But I'm working on 2 projects right now. One is Right Question, Right Time, which is a book about how leaders can drive innovation by asking right questions to their team in terms of how to push and inspire people to design really great breakthrough business models, and then how to track the progress they're making towards finding profitability. And then the other book I'm writing is something I call Uncomplacent. It's about how successful people, businesses, organizations, institutions can sort of stop being complacent when they acquire success. So one is more short term, right question, right time, and then the Uncomplacent project is more long term over the next couple of years.
All right. So last question, I promise, from me. So I'm just thinking. So during this pandemic and the lockdown and I guess you're working with a lot of different corporates, not only in the financial services industry but across industries. So yes. What's your insights? What was your experience Was it the same as I just told, like that every innovation unit is being shut down and people are letting go and the crisis business takes over and whatever? Or what's your experience?
Yeah, so obviously the experience differs on what impact the crisis has had on the organization. So some organizations haven't really felt the impact, and so about half or more of the organizations that we work with have doubled down on innovation. They've invested in more innovation projects, and actually, in terms of like just how busy I was last year driving innovation programs, and how busy I am this year, the amount of work I'm doing this year has actually doubled for those organizations. They've decided that this is the opportunity to actually put more money in innovation. And then for those organizations that have had like a negative impact from the crisis, they have to start thinking about cutting things. And so then they go to their list, which is HR, marketing, innovation, and then they get rid of those teams. Yeah.
All right. Tendayi, I could talk to you for many hours. Unfortunately, we don't have time. It was good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
So thank you so much for participating. We'll stay with us. We'll start up another panel just in a minute, but thank you very much, Tendayi.
Thank you, man. I'm going to put myself on and just listen in. Cheers.
Cheers.